All righty. Hey, welcome. Recording is in progress according to the very interesting voice.
Yep.
So thank you everybody and welcome to another Comics Goes to College with Stephen Bissette. We're excited to have you here. We are so pleased to have Stephen B, our guest for 9 of these episodes. We're in episode 2 basically. So make sure that you catch the others. Check out our website so you can get those. A common question has been, where will this recording be? Within a day or two, we will have a link on our website. So you will have to go to our website to get the link, where you can review other very cool recordings as well. Um, I also wanted to let you guys know that next week, November 3rd, if I get this wrong, Steve in Tucky, uh, correct me. But we have a thing about numbers and the number system, and it's by a mathematics professor, and it'll be very interesting, and it's that's also posted on our website if you'd like to check that out. So you can just keep going with ConCon if you would like to. The other thing is, if you have any questions, we will have some question and answer period at the end. But if you have some burning stuff, put it in the chat, and I will make sure that Stephen can so that those are answered throughout. And without further ado, I'll introduce my colleague here, one of the professors from Jackson College. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Steve.
Hey, my name is Steve Tucky. I am a professor at Jackson
Uh-oh.
College. You okay? You said, uh-oh. Is everything okay?
Yeah, I just thought I was falling back into my old pausing days. Sorry. Yep.
Well, I'm a professor in math and science at Jackson College, and one half of the team of people who's been working on putting together ConCon along with John Hart. And we're really pleased to have a 9 talk run with Stephen Bissette, who's terrific and wonderful and a great guy to work with, and even better to listen to. So I'm going to shut up and let you enjoy his presentation tonight. And so take it away, Stephen.
Hey, everybody, and welcome. And great to see so many familiar faces, including from my old Southern Vermont days. Hey, folks. Thanks for being here. This is Halloween week, so we put together a special Halloween presentation for you. If any of you either ever attended my classes or past college lectures at various universities, a couple of the items in tonight's talk might be familiar to you, but hopefully this will be all new for most of you. A couple of housekeeping things. Please keep your questions for the Q&A going on the chat. John Hart and Stephen will keep track of that. If there's any questions that are pressing to the moment, just ask them to interrupt me and they will read your question to me. Otherwise, we'll do a final Q&A at the end. And I do ask that you keep questions particular to the subject at hand. We're doing quite a number of talks in this series, and we'll be covering a lot of ground before we get to the end of February. I'll also point out that in November, the lectures will not be in alternating weeks. They're in 2 subsequent weeks in November, and that's because of where the Thanksgiving holiday falls and the college schedule. So I just wanted to bring that to all of your attention. Double check the calendar, and I'm also posting the calendar at the end of the talk, which I'll leave up during the Q&A session, so you can double check that. I also want to mention that a couple of the stories that I've included in tonight's presentation originally appeared in comic books that were published by DC Comics, and those stories are copyright, trademark, DC Entertainment. Because I wrote and drew them, I'm incorporating them. So without further ado, I am going to take a moment here to set up the screen share, and then we'll get into it. We were going to call this 4 stories and no funeral, but that would date the whole talk because most people have never heard of the movie that I was basing that riff on. So just forget I ever mentioned that, and let's go with this. Here we go. Okay, how's that? Happy Halloween, one and all. So Pages Paneled Ghosts. I'm going to be sharing with you tonight 1 monster story and 3 ghost stories. And in the midst of sharing those stories with you, I'm going to walk you through some of the nuts and bolts of my career in the American comic book industry and approaches to comics storytelling and approaches to panel and page design. We have a previous lecture that we did 2 weeks ago called Illustrating Regional Cryptozoological Lore, which was basically my, how to draw monsters talk. If you missed that or you'd like to revisit it, the recording is online and will be available throughout the coming year. And John Hart, Stephen Tuckey, and the crew here can steer you to those links at any point in time. I also post regularly to Facebook and occasionally to Twitter, and I will be sharing those links there. Tonight's lecture also is being recorded, and in a day or two will also be available at our sponsoring library's website. Okay, here we go. So my comics career sort of starts here. I mean, I was drawing comics from a tender age, but in 1976, a couple of friends of mine at Johnson State College up in Johnson, Vermont, which is no longer called Johnson State College. I think it's now part of the Northeast College network. The campus is still there, but it's no longer called Johnson. One of my friends, Tim Varick by name, we called him Doc, was enjoying the work in my sketchbook. And Doc said, Steve, if you ever want to do a comic, I'll pay for the print run. And for the princely sum of $200 back in 1976, 200 copies of my first comic, Abyss #1 and only, were published. And in here were a number of original stories, including the first collaboration that I ever got to do with my late friend, Stephen Perry. But what I want to share with you is a story that appeared in Abyss that I transcribed out of my high school sketchbook. My drawing skills were a bit better once I had a couple of years of art classes at Johnson. So without further ado, let me share with you a short, what shall I call this? This is sort of something to whet your appetite for the rest of the evening. And it is a story entitled Cries of the Vegetable Kingdom. The beans, they hurl their young to the soil to be trampled into it. Nug, nug. K, k, yeah. Fuck, fluff. Chunk, guk. Yeah. That's the end. Cries of the Vegetable Kingdom, a story I designed for my vegetarian friends. Whenever they tried to pull a guilt trip on me, I would share Cries of the Vegetable Kingdom with them. Notice the signature from November of 1975 when I finished this particular piece. I originally signed my work Spider, and that's where I learned one of my first professional lessons. When I was a student at the Joe Kubert School of Cartoon and Graphic Art, I was among the first graduating class from Joe and Muriel Kubert's brand new experiment in education. The experiment worked out. The Joe Kubert School is still open, still running, still training generation after generation after generation of cartoonists and storytellers. I was there from the fall of 1976 until my graduation in the spring of 1978. And as part of our classes at the Joe Kubert School, we had a class called Professional Practices, where we had to design the portfolio that we were going to be taking around to art directors. And we also had to design and print up our first business cards. And ladies and gentlemen, that is my first business card down at the bottom. I learned a hard lesson very quickly, which was I best not sign my work Spider. One of the first art directors I visited in New York City looking for work turned out to be an arachnophobe. And when I handed her my business card, she dropped it on the ground, and that is not a job I got. as a freelancer. So I changed my business card. So it just read S.R. Bissette, cartoonist. I got rid of the spider image, and was already out there hustling for work during my first year at the Kubert School. It was a 2-year program at the time. During my 2 years at the Kubert School, I managed to start building my freelance accounts. Among them were a work study program that Joe Kubert offered at the school, but Joe also extended to me the honor of being the first new cartoonist to be published in a brand new comics publication that Joe Kubert was launching called Sojourn. It was an oversized newspaper format comic magazine. Joe had grown up reading the great classic golden age of Sunday comics, and he wanted to return to that size and scope that the Sunday pages had back in the 1930s and early 1940s. I am the artist featured at the bottom of this cover of #1. I had a feature that was a centerfold poster, and it was entitled Kingdom of the Maggot, and it was going to be a continuing story presented issue after issue with single spectacular double-page spread images, 1 image per issue. Unfortunately, Sojourn only lasted 2 issues, so I didn't get too far into the adventures of the Kingdom of the Maggot. But I was among the students, including classmates like Tom Yates, Rick Veitch, later on Tim Truman, Jan Duursema, Tom Mandrake, who cut our teeth doing professional work for Joe Kubert that would be published in Sergeant Rock, which was the comic book that Joe Kubert was editing still for DC Comics throughout the 1970s. Sometimes we got to do a single page humor, like gag page for the war comics. They would always have to have a war or a GI theme. But the really coveted gigs for Sergeant War were the battle albums, in part because they were usually 2-page spreads like this one. This meant you got paid for 2 pages. By the way, this spread is one that I wrote and drew. And when I presented the thumbnails and the script to Joe, he read it and he went, okay, you have to prove to me that each one of these things is real. I did prove it to Joe. I had articles and clippings that I had used. One of them, the one that's the main piece here with the dolphins wearing nose cones with air injection devices on the end, had a fairly dubious source. It was an article out of We magazine, if you're familiar with the men's magazines from that era, but still it was in print. And Joe said, okay, you satisfied my needs as an editor. The really coveted positions though were if we could sell Joe Kubert on a backup story. And the backup stories in Sergeant Rock could run anywhere from 1 or 2 pages to up to 6 pages. I was constantly trying to convince Joe to let me do either a war horror story or to do a new take on the war that time forgot, which were the Robert Kanigher scripted DC war comics from the early 60s that featured soldiers during World War II fighting dinosaurs and prehistoric animals. Joe was not going to let that happen. He made that very clear to me that I was highly unlikely to be able to sell him a script that would satisfy him, that would involve the war that time forgot. So typical of a freelancer, I found a workaround, and that leads to the second story I can read you tonight, appropriate to the Halloween season. This is the monster story that I managed to sell to Joe. And it is a story entitled Crabs, and it is set in World War II in the Pacific Theater. We hit the beach at dawn, a 10-man recon patrol. Lord knows how many times this stinking little island changed hands between our side and the Japanese. Now it was our turn to take it back. Parks captured him as soon as we landed. Sorry, sir, but all I can make out of his lingo is crabs. He keeps repeating it over and over. Well, where there's one enemy soldier, there's more. And they won't be happy to see us. So stay alert. Hey, look what I found this guy's pack. A hermit crab. What's that you got, ears? A hermit crab using an old powder horn for home. These guys will use anything for shelter if they can't find a real shell. That powder horn must be pretty old. I reckon so. Maybe left on this island long ago. Merchants or Navy or maybe pirates. Let's go. We've got an island to patrol. Come on, little fella. You're staying with me for a while. I find myself thinking about this island in a funny way. I mean, people's homes have been turned into articles of war ever since this war began. And surely even this island was once a home for somebody or something. Split up, 2 patrols, 5 men each. Ears, I want you to come in and stay in constant radio contact with the 2nd patrol. Yes, sir. The thing was, looks like this island was a powerful Japanese base. Funny thing, but every piece of hardware looked like it had already seen all the war it could take. Look at that pillbox. It's been split wide open. On your toes. Could be a trap. Well, if it is, somebody sprung it long ago. Sarge, this don't make any sense. We're the first Marines here. It looks like we already missed the war. No telling how long ago this happened. Probably back when they took the island from us. Ears, got 2nd patrol on the phone. You read me, Buster? What have you turned up? There's more hardware here than the base figured. But it's all been torn to pieces. Just dead jacks and crabs all over the place. Okay, Ears, over and out. Hey, Sarge, well, look at this critter. He's powerful, strong for his size. Yeah, well, pack it in. Our job isn't over with yet. Another box, ripped open like it was a paper bag. God, there's crabs all over in there. Sarge, what's going on? Look, all this is remains from long past battles. Their new base must be on the other side of the island. Ears, get 2nd patrol. I keep bringing them up, Sarge, but all I can get, just static. Trying to get further up the trail. Maybe some interference. We trudged on through the hot, sticky silence, but our sweat was cold as ice. We weren't worried about running into the enemy. Crabs, hundreds of them. Funny how they'll make a home out of any old piece of junk. Hey, they're all heading in the same direction. Toward that pillbox. Spread apart. Be ready for anything. What are they after? Good Lord, there's bodies under them. Sarge, what's going on? They haven't been dead for more than a few hours. Ears, you set up and don't move until you got 2nd patrol on the phone, or stand put until they can join up with us. It's no good. It's no good. I can't get them. Keep trying. Sarge, what? Good Lord, Sarge, don't leave me alone. I ran up over the dune, my heart pounding in my ears, but gone. They're all gone. They were shooting, screaming. Where? 4 men don't just disappear in the thin air. Wait, that tank turret. That's the same one laying near every pillbox. When the Japs found me, I was squatting in the sand. We found him just like this an hour ago, sir. We know his patrol's around. They've done much damage to our base. Has he said anything? Well, you know, even then, I couldn't help but think. All I could make out of his language was something about crabs. Sir, our men have found the American patrol. They've all been killed, hidden in the debris. They're a dismantled tank turret. About how any article of war can be turned into a home. That's it. That's that story. That's the closest I got to doing a War of the Time for God story for DC Comics. No dinosaur, but at least I got a giant crab into it. Now, people often ask where writers get ideas for stories, and I will share with you on each of these stories where the ideas came from. For instance, the first story I shared with you tonight, well, it was more an anecdote than a story, came from in high school, a couple of my friends who were budding vegetarians giving me and a couple of my buddies crap because we weren't vegetarians. And I had been reading a number of science texts about the sentient nature of plant life as it was being discovered. So that's where Cries of the Vegetable Kingdom came from. The story I just shared with you, Crabs, was inspired when my friend Rick Beach decided he was going to bring something home to his young son, Ezra Beach. Ezra is no longer so young. Ezra is now a man and has his own son. So anyway, Rick had decided he was going to get a hermit crab for Ezra. And for a couple of days, we had this little hermit crab living with us in the shared house that Rick Veach, John Tuttleman, Tom Yates, Sue Belinsky, and I were sharing in New Jersey. And having that hermit crab around is what gave me the idea for Crabs. So from 1977 to 78, during my last year at the Kubert School as a senior or a second year student, it was a 2-year program, and the beginning of my first year in freelancing in the rest of 1978 after our May graduation, I was out there hustling for freelance work. And one of the first gigs I landed was thanks to Joe Kubert. During my time at the Kubert School, Joe was approached by 2 editors up at Scholastic Publications. Their names were Bob and Jane Stein. And for most of you, you'll better know Bob Stein under his writing name, R.L. Stein. Yes, the man who later created the entire Goosebumps series. And at the time, they were editing a number of magazines at Scholastic that were distributed to schools, primarily middle school, junior high school, and early high school years. And those magazines included Bananas, which was a full-color, slick magazine. And because 1977 was the year in which George Lucas's Star Wars was a surprise smash hit, that very year, Scholastic Publications launched their own science fiction monster magazine called Weird Worlds. It did not have a long lifespan. Weird Worlds lasted about 2 years, a little over 2 years. But before they published issue number 1, they came to Joe Kubert and asked if Joe would put together a 2 to 3 page horror story that could be published in Weird Worlds in comic form. Bob and Jane Stein scripted the stories, old school scripting, where they did not type them on a typewriter. They drew the scripts on paper with pencil, and they would draw it with stick figures and hand lettered word balloons and captions. And those were the scripts that we worked from. And Joe tapped me to do the artwork on the very first story. I did not get my name on the first story. It was credited to the Joe Kubert School, but I ended up doing everything but the lettering on the story, pencils and inks. My modus operandi was, I remember when I was a kid in school and teachers took away my comic books and monster magazines. So I thought the best way to approach this kind of job wasn't to draw it in a child-friendly or humorous fashion. I took Bob and Jane's often quite amusing scripts and drew them like they were the most kick-ass monster movie ever filmed. Joe loved it. The first story was a werewolf story, and Joe was very happy with what I'd done. And when I graduated from the Kubert School, with the blessings of Bob and Jane Stein, Joe gifted me that freelance contract. And when you're a young freelancer, just out of school, that kind of gift is amazing. So I continued drawing for every issue but one of Weird Worlds. There was one issue where Joe indeed drew the story. These were all fun stories to draw. They were often quite silly scripts, but they were a lot of fun to draw. And they hit all the bases in terms of, there was a mummy story, there was a vampire story, there was a werewolf story. And again, when I would work from Bob and Jane's scripts, even though the scripts were often quite silly, I would go to town with the artwork. My agenda was that I was drawing this story for the monster kid I had been in school when my comics were taken away from me. So when they had a vampire story about a count who, during some sort of gathering in a European castle, seduces a young woman who, at the moment when he bites her neck, her chest explodes and a stake shoots out of her into the heart of the vampire and kills the vampire. It turns out she is a vampire hunting robot. That was the script. I still made sure that the artwork for the story was the best looking Hammer film never made. All right, let me share another story with you. During this time, I also began landing a couple of freelance accounts where I was asked to do really short pieces. And because I had grown up loving short fiction, I'm definitely a child who grew up reading Edgar Allan Poe and later on H.P. Lovecraft, Richard Matheson, Ray Bradbury. I love doing these little 2- and 3-page stories. So I'm going to share the other 2 stories tonight I'm sharing with you are very short ghost stories. They're original. This first story is credited in the comic book that was published to my late friend Bill Kelly. That's because when I turned in the story, which I had scripted, penciled, and inked, DC Comics had a problem with that because with work for hire arrangements, they legally could not claim it was work for hire if the same person had done every aspect of the job. So the solution to the problem was I called up my friend Bill Kelly, who I had helped in scripting stories for DC a number of times, and to the agreement of all parties, including editorial head at DC at the time, Dick Giordano, who had been one of my teachers at the Kubert School. Bill Kelly's name went on this story, and that allowed me to get paid for the work, and it saw print. So here's a short ghost story. Where are you? She has wandered these halls since she was a little girl, searching. Where are you? A search that left her apart from life, unaware of age. Where are you? And oblivious of the grave. She searches for something forever precious, forever treasured, forever elusive. Well, where are you? She drifts from room to room. Where are you? Unmindful of the horrors that lurk behind every door. Where? Until her beloved quarry is nearly within reach. Oh, there you are. You naughty dear. Only to find it has once again evaded her. Oh, where are you? It has wandered these halls since she was a little girl, a plaything possessed by a mindless mischief corrupted into malevolence. It has always eluded her. Where are you? It always will. Where are you? And she will always be the seeker. Okay, let me shift gears for the first time tonight. I'll do this again with the final story. And let's start talking about how a story like this is put together. Now, that story I just read to you was only 2 pages. I got a call from an editor. Somebody had either missed a deadline or a 2-page ad slot had dropped out of the publication. But anyway, this editor was in a panic. They had a 2-page opening in the current issue of Secrets of Haunted House. And when they called, they said, Steve, I've never worked with you before, but I hear you do good horror stuff. Do you have a 2-page ghost story? And I said, yeah, sure, no problem. How soon do you need it? And we worked out the terms and the deadline. We got off the phone, and then I had to think of a 2-page story. I didn't have any idea for a 2-page story when I said, yes, I did. But when you're a freelancer, especially a young, hungry freelancer, it's hard to turn down work. Now, I promised you tonight I would tell you where story ideas came from in the cases of the stories I'm sharing with you tonight. And this story idea came from nowhere. This story came from probably something I laid my eyes on for all of 10 or 15 seconds when I was about 10 years old. Back in the old days, I was born in 1955. So when I was 10, 11, it was 1965, 1966. I grew up in Duxbury, Vermont, Waterbury, Vermont area. The towns in Vermont, most of the towns, including Waterbury, had open burn dumps. We didn't call them landfills. And this is before environmental laws really kicked in. So there were open dumps that would be only open one day of the week, usually Saturday mornings between 8 and noon. My dad would give me a shout. I'd climb into the back of the pickup. My job was to throw the garbage into the truck, jump in the passenger side, ride with dad to the local Waterbury dump. And when he pulled up to the burn area. He would back the truck as close as he could comfortably get to the burn area. And my job was to jump out of the passenger side into the back of the pickup and throw the garbage out. As I was throwing the garbage out, there was the grossest, saddest little teddy bear I ever saw in my life, right by where the burn was. And the bear had been partially scarred by, the fire either that morning or at some point during the week. And I never forgot that little bear. I didn't think about it often. And I don't know why that image leaped into my mind that afternoon when I was sitting there trying to cook up a 2-page ghost story, but it did. And once that image was in my head, that's what I worked around, right? That was the seed for this entire story idea, was that 10, 15-second glimpse of a sad little burning teddy bear when I was 10 or 11 years old. Now, it was a comic book called Secrets of Haunted House. So I thought, oh, I got a 2-page opening here. How about if I work in something in the story that suggests that there's other stories in this haunted house? Because the title, Secrets of Haunted House, it wasn't Secrets of the Haunted House or Secrets of a Haunted House. It was one of those odd comic book titles, Secrets of Haunted House. So that's why this second page, the final page of the story, has that first panel suggesting that there's all kinds of weird, undead, spectral forms and stories in every room of this house. Building the story around a character who's moving around this house was the natural hook that I latched onto. Then I had the idea, we tend to link teddy bears with little kids. And that's when I had the idea of a ghost who was a little girl. And as she moved through the house, she aged. And that is the old crone that we see, the actually skeletal crone that we see moving around at the top of this second page. Now, this was the kind of visual conceit, and this is the power of the comics medium, that it's easy to communicate visually in a comic book story, but it would be a little clumsy to try to communicate, and it would not have the same impact if I had written this as a literary short story. There are certain things you can do in comics just by showing the reader what might be difficult or clumsy to describe in text form alone, much less have the image stick with the reader throughout the entire story. This gave me the fluidity of having that protagonist, this haunted woman, moving through the haunted house, and she's never going to catch up with this malicious little bear. So that she begins the story as a little girl like Alice in Wonderland, and she ends the story again as the little girl Alice in Wonderland. And I mentioned Alice in Wonderland because I deliberately designed her character from the first and last panels to resemble John Tenniel's great illustrations for Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. It's the kind of shorthand that we can use in comics where we don't even have to reference overtly anything. If we're just modeling after a character, it carries a lot of weight. And I'm going to come back to that in the final story I share with you today. Now, let's also talk about how we read comics. I would say for about almost 20 years, I often attended comic book conventions, sometimes with some of the friends who are here tonight, like Alan Goldstein, Jim Wheelock. And one of the things that comic conventions used to have is, especially the larger conventions, would have a little separate area that was outside the dealer's room, away from the speaker halls and the guest artist areas. And there'd be a little eating, drinking area, place you could get a soft drink, sometimes a sandwich or a bag of potato chips. And often you could sit there and you could watch people read comics without being a creepy guy, right? And off and on over the years, I sort of studied, looking at people's eyes, how they read comics. And I settled on there are 3 ways that people read comics. And this is entirely observational. I am not a social scientist. I did not do an official study, but just based on watching people read their booty at comic book conventions, 3 ways that people read comics. There are text-oriented people who will open up a comic. Sometimes you'll see their eyes kind of, shoot all over the page. They'll drink in the artwork, but then they'll go back to the top left-hand corner. We're talking about North American readers here. And they will read every piece of text on the page in a very strict manner. You can see their eye go from caption to balloon to balloon to balloon to caption to balloon. and they'll read the entire page, and then they'll go back up, and you'll see them kind of drink in the artwork, going over the same panels they've just read, and now they're reading it visually. Then there's the very rational, logistical people who begin on the top left of the page, and they read the text and they study the picture before they go to the next picture. Then the third kind of reader is the person who visually reads the page. They don't just scan the page without stopping and reading the text. They read each panel visually in the order that looks correct to them on the page. And then when they get to the bottom of the page, or in the case of a double page spread, the end of 2 pages, you'll see their eyes track back up to the top left, and they will then read the text. Why am I telling you all this? Well, if you're going to be a cartoonist working the comics medium, whether it's comic books or graphic novels, I realized early on, I have to design the page so that all 3 readers will read this page in exactly the order I, the visual storyteller, need them to read it. Whatever their preference as a reader, whatever their prejudice is as a reader, I've got to design this page so there's one way to read this page. It's one of the reasons when I do comic jobs, and this is how it's been since my brush with working with Marvel Comics in the late 70s, early 80s, I insist on placing the word balloons in captions. That is part of my job, to my mind, as the penciler. I'm designing the page. The pencil artist is doing the storytelling, but the placement of the word balloons, the placement of the captions is just as or more essential than the placement of the pictures. Now, I've had this page up for a certain period of time. Let me walk you through my decisions. Everything about the design of this page is to carry your eye in the directions I want your eye to go, okay? The captions and the balloons for the first 2 panels have to be toward the top of the page, because I don't want you to accidentally have your eye come down and skip inset panel 2 and go down to panel 3, okay? So that's why the captions are against the top of both panel 1 and 2. And the word balloons are placed high. Where? Oh, there you are. I also decided to lean that first shot. The door is leaned at a diagonal. It's not just to create a creepy akimbo shot of a haunted house room, although that certainly helps. It's also to create a diagonal that pulls your eye in the direction of panel 2. Specifically, the door frame and the edge of the door coming toward you is like an arrow bringing your eye right up to the caption at the top of panel 2. I also designed that shadow of that that axe-wielding skeletal figure so that that also pulls your eye in that direction. And you'll notice that with the inking, I included a few sort of broken speed lines. That's also to pull your eye with the illusion of movement toward panel 2. Okay, panel 2 is classically framed as an inset panel. We call those inset panels. And there's a few tricks you can pull with inset panels, right? If I had drawn that panel so it sat entirely within panel 1, it would have been a cramped panel with a caption and 2 word balloons. But by cutting off the top of the box, I can then move my lettering right to the top of the panel, and it gives me a little more breathing space in panel 2. And even getting a fraction of an inch of breathing space in a comics page is hyper important. Okay, let's go down to panel 3. All right, and I'm counting panel 3 is the You Naughty Dear panel. Panel 4 is the Oh, Where Are You panel. Panel 5 is the circular inset panel. I originally had designed this page in my thumbnails with her moving the way in comics you typically would have a figure move in action. I originally had her going from right to left with the bear in the doorway over by the left. But then I realized when I got to the pencil stage and placed the word balloons that the tail of the word balloon, tail meaning that pointer that indicates who's speaking, exerted a stronger directional pull than what direction the teddy bear moved in. Does this make sense to everybody? So By having "you naughty dear" and "oh, where are you" placed as I do, the tails of the word balloon become the stronger graphic element that act as arrows pulling you over to panel 5, the circular inset panel. This is part of why I lay in with Croquill pen the directional lines of the boards on the bottom of the floor of the hallway. So everything, including that caption that I placed between panels 3 and 4, is designed to pull your eye over to the circular inset panel. Now, most comic books and most graphic novels, especially graphic novels these days, tend to have very conservative layouts. They tend to go with 6 to 9 panel grids. And I hate the grid. I understand the strength of the panel grid on a page. It gives you this metronomic pacing with a comic. It's very easy to read. There's rarely any confusion for the reader as to where to look next. But geometric shapes of panels carry enormous graphic power on a page. And my entire intention as a cartoonist is to lend all the emotional weight to the stories that I tell as I possibly can. I want you to feel this story. Circular panels are geometrically and graphically powerful images in and of themselves. Part of it is, and I'll carry over an element from the stage. If you've ever seen a play on stage, live theater, or you've been to a concert, and I think it's fair to presume that all of you have done one of those two things, if not both of those things, you have seen the use of a spotlight. A single spotlight shining on a musician or an actor playing a role immediately pulls your attention to that person, to that figure, to that character, to that musician. And circular panels, particularly close-ups in a circular panel, have the same or more impact in the comics medium. And that is why the only close-up in this page is that teddy bear. This is the climax of the story. This is the point of the story. This is also the hook that was the genesis for this entire story. That teddy bear is the catalyst for this story. And I really wanted that teddy bear to be a disturbing image for you to carry away. Finally, where do I put that caption? It has wandered these halls since she was a little girl. Editors, when editors are placing word balloons in captions, they will tend to be very utilitarian and place captions wherever they see room. I had to make sure it was at the bottom right of that circular panel. But I had to be careful because I also did not want that caption to pull your eye directly down into the final page of that bottom 3-panel tier. So there's more spacing. If you look carefully at those last 3 panels, the spacing between the top of each panel border and where the line of lettering is exaggerated a bit. And the final line, "and she will always be the seeker," is further away from the top of the panel than it has always eluded her, the first panel in that bottom tier. Now, I cheat a little bit on that bottom tier. I'm using a film trick there. A lot of times in comics, we'll use certain tropes from other media. Often people confuse comics and cinema. There's a lazy shorthand that people think if something works in comics or a graphic novel, it'll make a perfect movie. And we've all seen plenty of examples to prove that just isn't true. It's not a natural transition between the two media. But sometimes there's devices that work in one media that work wonderfully in the other. And in this case, I wanted to end with the teddy bear being the largest thing in the panel, because the danger in this story, the ghost in this story, which is the malicious element, is not the little girl. The little girl is the victim ghost. She's the one who's now, through all eternity, going to be stalking these halls looking for this bear. This bear is a little son of a bitch in the afterlife. So I used sort of a fake deep focus device in those last 3 panels where I bring the bear closer to the foreground and move the figure of the old woman who's becoming a little girl further and further into the background, even though we're only talking about a distance of a few feet there. The bear's in a doorway, the little girl's in a hallway. But graphically it works. And it also graphically means the darkest, largest, most ominous thing in the last panel is the bear. Mission accomplished. So here's just some of the thinking that goes on when a storyteller working the comics medium is wrestling with the comics page. There's a few other things I could point out. For instance, every aspect of a page is a tool in your toolkit. Notice that the dimensions of the gutters between panels. The gutters between the totality of the top tier, panel 1 and 2 is the top tier, the gutter is a little thicker between that top tier and panel 3, You Naughty Dear. And I again repeat the thicker white open gutter between Oh, Where Are You and the bottom 3 tiers. It's not much space, you know, mere millimeters. But again, in a comic page, when I'm telling this entire story to you in just 2 pages, anything I can do to work with the positive and negative space on a page is a tool that I can work with to lead your eye or keep you reading in a way that should be completely unconscious to you. Okay, I'll move on. When I was still at the Kubert School, I was one of the first Americans to luck into selling a 1-page story to Heavy Metal the very first year of the magazine in 1977. The art director up there was John Workman, and John really liked my work. It was rare that I had something in my portfolio or an idea that fit Heavy Metal, but whenever I did, John would commission it. And that was a real feather in my cap to have stories in Heavy Metal. This led to, unexpectedly, in 1979, Heavy Metal was stuck. They had contracted with Universal Pictures and Columbia Pictures to do a comic adaptation in book form of 1941, the brand new film coming out from director Steven Spielberg. The term graphic novel didn't really exist yet. In fact, the term graphic novel, even though it had been introduced, if we look back on the history, the first use of the term is around 1969 and early 1971, but it didn't catch on until 1978 when Will Eisner published A Contract with God and called it right on the cover a graphic novel. In 1979, when this project was being prepared for bookstore distribution, graphic novel had not caught on as the market term that it quickly became. So it was called 1941, The Illustrated Story. And this had to be a full color painted graphic novel that we had to do in a very short period of time. If memory serves, we had something like 4 months in which to do this. Rick Veitch and I were the ones that tried out for the job. We did an audition, which was the painted cover and some sample pages. John Workman loved it, everybody approved it, and we got the gig. That led to Rick Veitch and I working up some other samples for potential work. And this meant that sometimes in our little house there in New Jersey that we shared with John Tottleben and Tom Yates and Sue Belinsky, Rick and I would just come up with an idea for an illustration. We would just do it. We didn't have a home for it yet. It was not a commissioned work. There was no way we were going to get paid for it. We both had grown up with the sea monkey ads in the back of comic books. And so we came up with the idea of, okay, well, what if there were sea monkeys? What would they be like? And this is what we came up with. This was a double-page spread, no captions on it. The artwork I'm showing you now is scanned from the version that finally saw print in Epic Illustrated, Marvel Comics, full-color adult comic magazine, which was their competition for Heavy Metal. We brought it up to John Workman at Heavy Metal. He loved this artwork. He said, if you can come up with a story, I'll buy it. We came up with a story. John didn't go for it. We once, and when I say we, Rick Veitch, John Tottleben, Tom Yates, and I, we all once laid out on the floor of the living room of the house that we shared all the artwork we had brought up to John Workman at Heavy Metal. And we separated the ones that John Workman had bought from the larger section of stories and artwork that John Workman had not purchased. And we realized that Heavy Metal only bought stories that made no literal sense, that made no linear sense. And that's part of why Rick Veitch landed one of his first big sales to Heavy Metal with little tiny comics, which were like beat poetry comics. Anyway, we ended up selling this to Marvel Comics, and this story that we concocted around this illustration, this was the climax of the story, appeared in Epic Illustrated #2. I ended up doing a fair amount of work for Marvel Comics in the late 70s, early 80s, including a story that appeared in Bizarre Adventures. I did a few stories for Bizarre Adventures, but 2 of the ones that I did with Bizarre Adventures were written by a very close friend, the late Steve Perry. The one that we got the best feedback from was a story called A Frog is a Frog. This was a story that I entirely painted in black and white wash and gouache, and also used grayscale color pencils. The wall I hit is using these kind of illustrative techniques on the comics, which the editors loved, but the printers hated. The printing on the Marvel black and white magazines was so shoddy that this artwork came out looking pretty horrible in a lot of the print run. It was different when I was doing this kind of artwork for Scholastic magazines, where all their magazines were on slick paper, top-notch production, excellent printing. But I had to stop drawing in this painterly fashion because the work just did not reproduce well. When you're working as a commercial artist, freelancing in an industry like comic books, you have to do your work to match how it's going to be printed, not how it looks to the naked eye. From 83 to 87, I had the great pleasure and the great privilege to work with some very close friends on the saga of the Swamp Thing for DC Comics. Our first editor was co-creator of Swamp Thing, Len Wein, who was the writer who, with artist Bernie Wrightson, originally co-created Swamp Thing. And we started working with a writer named Marty Pasco, who left the series about 4 issues in on the run that I did with my friend John Totleben and Rick Beach. And a new writer was brought on board, a British writer named Alan Moore, who had never written for American comics before. And it ended up being quite a merry trip, let me tell you. One of the things I had to relearn, I had to reteach myself, something that we had studied and had assignments to cover in the Kubert School. But after all those years I had done of painted and drawn and fully penciled and inked comic pages, where I was doing everything or I was collaborating with friends hands-on, I had to teach myself how to pencil. Yes, I was penciling for an artist I knew. John Totleben and I were and remained very close friends. But I still had to turn in pencils that the editor could see, read, and either approve or request changes to. So I had to teach myself very quickly, in a matter of 1 or 2 issues, how to pencil so that everything was on the page it needed to be on the page. Even though I knew a lot of what I was putting on the page, John was going to handle in his own way. And that was the fun of the collaboration with John Totleben and Rick Beach. Not to be pretentious, but when we got the gig with Swamp Thing, we looked at what everybody had done with the character and we went, you know, people are kind of missing the boat. Like, everybody's depicting Swamp Thing like this human being who was caught in a lab accident caused by espionage, and he fell flaming into the swamp, and he didn't die. He came out of the swamp as Swamp Thing. So he was kind of this sad guy covered with moss and mud. And the series kept revolving around how was he going to turn back into a man? We thought that was all wrong. We thought, this is a powerful character, and this goes back to the ancient Celtic European archetype of the Green Man, this powerful humanoid figure that was wedded with the environment. This was a being that expressed the essence of not just the plant kingdom, but fertility and seasonal harvests and the power of the earth. And that's really what we thought Swamp Thing should be. Our first few issues on Swamp Thing, working with writer Marty Pasco, you know, that wasn't in the ballpark. Marty wasn't interested in that. But once Alan Moore was on board, that's exactly what Alan Moore wanted to do as well. And it was a very happy day when Alan, John, and I found that in our exchange of letters, we all had wanted to go in the same direction. And because Alan Moore wanted to do it, Len Wein was now okay with it. Shortly after Len Wein was no longer our editor, when Karen Berger began editing the book with the 25th issue, we lost the Comics Code Authority. And I won't go into any detail about the Comics Code because John and Stephen can steer you all to a lecture that's already on the library database that I gave back in February or March, that you're welcome to go visit. And it's pretty much a crash course on the Comics Code Authority, horror comics, and what happened with Saga of the Swamp Thing 29. But in short form, I can tell you this. Every Halloween, I kind of hug myself thinking, we lost the Comics Code. And we lost the Comics Code with this page. And this is a kick-ass page of horror comics, ladies and gentlemen. By the way, this is the page that lost us initially, the Comics Code. Initially, we lost it because of the flies that are buzzing around the zombies. Again, you can go back and revisit that lecture that's already up on the website to get the details. But we found out the Comics Code didn't read comics. They didn't read the text. They read the pictures first. So when we defended the flies having to be there, then the code went back and actually read the issue, and with the balloon, just say uncle, realized there was an incest angle here going on in the story, and that's what ultimately lost us the code. But you know what? Losing the code on Swamp Thing was the best thing that could have happened. DC ended up sticking with us. They released the issue without any changes, without the code seal of approval, and within just 2 issues, Swamp Thing became DC Comics' first full-run periodical without submission to the Comics Code Authority. And this became the ground zero of what became, in the early 90s, Vertigo Comics. The entire Vertigo Comics line grew out of this. By the way, when we lost the Comics Code, yeah, we suddenly had license to maybe go further than we ever had before with horror, but we took it in the direction of, we could now tell our love story about how does a human being and a plant elemental consummate their love when these 2 beings are truly in love with one another. And a lot of our run on Swamp Thing after we lost the code is as much a psychedelic era romance comic as it is a cutting edge horror comic for its day and age. We still played the horror quotient. One of the stories I had not been able to sell to heavy metal that John Workman couldn't quite make head or tail of was a story that involved an imaginary science fiction novel that I concocted. And the idea for the science fiction novel, which was called Luna Bridge, is that there was an alien, a female alien in space, who had a mind connection with an Earth woman who was a lycanthrope. She was a werewolf, but her lycanthropy cycle was tied in with her menstrual cycle. And that was the hook of the science fiction novel. That was refused by heavy metal. They turned down the piece I had brought in. But once Alan Moore, John Tollivan, Rick Veitch, and I were exchanging ideas of where we might go with Swamp Thing, I pitched that idea to Alan Moore, and he loved it. And that turned into the premise of Swamp Thing number 40, our werewolf issue. After I left Swamp Thing, between 1986 and 1993, I was putting up pretty much, every minute of every day into a new horror anthology that John Tollivan and I decided to launch when we got an invitation from Cerebus creator Dave Sim. Dave Sim said, I will bankroll whatever you guys want to do. Now, we knew Dave Sim's idea was that Alan Moore, John Tollivan, Rick Veitch, and I should just pull up stakes in DC, do our own Swamp Monster comic as an independent, self-published comic. But that's not what John and I wanted to do. We wanted to bring horror into the 1980s, the way we were seeing horror exploding in the literary field. I mean, there was one month where every best-selling book on the New York Times bestseller list were Stephen King books. Horror was huge at that time. All the great movies that were coming out in the theaters in the early 80s were horror films, right? From directors like Joe Dante Jr. and David Cronenberg and John Carpenter, kicked off, no coincidence given our time of year, by the success of John Carpenter's Halloween at the end of the 1970s. John Tollivan and I wanted to pull horror comics into the 20th century. We admired what EC Comics had done with the horror genre in the early 1950s, but really not much of anybody outside of the underground comics movement in the late 60s, early 70s had pulled the horror genre into what was happening in every other media form. And that was the intention with Taboo. Every issue of Taboo, there were 10 in all, were over 100 pages of all new material of the most disturbing comics stories we could find, literally from around the world. You would think, having my own horror anthology, I could do a ton of the kind of comic stories I wanted to do. Well, I'll tell you something, folks. If you want to do your own work, don't edit an anthology, because all your time suddenly goes into being an editor and a business person. I did end up doing 2 stories that were published in Taboo, my favorite of which is the ghost story Cottonmouth. And no, this is not the 4th story I'm going to read to you tonight, because it's a little too adult in content and a little too esoteric for this particular venue. But if you're curious, Cottonmouth appeared in Taboo number 1 and also was expanded and reprinted in an early issue of Gore Shriek and in Spider Baby Comics number 1. During the glory years of Taboo, we got to work with some of the best artists from around the world, including the great late Jean Giraud, better known as Mobius, one of the heroes from the heavy metal years. And we got busted in every English-speaking country in the world. Customs popped us in every English-speaking country in the world. So Taboo was a very expensive lesson, but I have no regrets. I'm still really happy I got to do it. Having completely busted the bank and ended up near impoverished level, in 1992, we were approached by Image Comics. Jim Valentino, one of the original 6 Image Comics creators, called me and asked if there's anything that Alan Moore and I might want to do with Image Comics. So before calling Alan Moore, I called my buddy Rick Beach and said, "Hey, Rick, I just got this interesting call from Image Comics. They're up for our doing anything we want to do. We would own it, and we would keep 80% of whatever the revenue was after the cost of publication and printing." Rick said, "Yeah, I'm game." And then we called Alan Moore, and Alan Moore was up for it. And we ended up doing a 6-issue comic series that we called 1963. And with this comic series, I took a whole different approach to my own artwork. I hate superheroes, right? From the age of 4, I could believe in a giant 50-foot gorilla trashing New York City before I could invest any emotional believability into a man dressing up like a bat to fight crime. I have never, ever, ever fallen in love with superheroes, but I had a lot of fun working on 1963. Now, part of that is because, okay, 2 of the 3 superheroes I worked on were essentially monsters, okay? N-Man, the nuclear man, he was basically a lobster man. And I had a lot of fun working on N-Man. The look of N-Man was completely my design. Alan Moore had only one description for me to work with, and that was, "He should look good coming through a wall, Stephen." And that's what I ran with. I made sure N-Man looked great crashing through a wall. But the character I really loved drawing, and I was really surprised at this, was the Fury. This was like our take on the Daredevil, both the Golden Age Daredevil and the Silver Age Daredevil, and also sort of our spin on the Amazing Spider-Man. But it was really our take on all the athletic teenage superheroes, or young adult superheroes. The fun I had was, I was going to get to work with inker Dave Gibbons. And though I'd met Dave Gibbons very early on, back in 1986, when Dave and Alan Moore's first wife, Phyllis, came into New York City to deliver the initial pages of Watchmen to DC Comics. And I really hit it off with Dave. Dave's one of the most likable guys, one of the most likable people who ever worked in comics during my lifetime. But getting to work with Dave Gibbons as inker meant that I could pencil for a whole different quality of line work than I could bring to my own work, or that John Tolobin brought to the work that John and I did together. It also meant that I could play around with the athletics of comics. I mean, I get it now that part of the fun of drawing superhero comics is the human body moving through space. And that's what I really played with the Fury. A lot of my page designs would struggle with, okay, how do I stick to the grid that Alan Moore wants, which is appropriate to the 1963 Silver Age era we're emulating, but still pull the reader's eye. And I would do tricks like you're seeing here, where in the second panel on the top tier, the Fury is flipping off a flagpole down toward the bottom left of the panel, and he's completing the motion, the first panel at the bottom tier. In other cases, I would draw the figure in such a way that it was up to Dave Gibbons with the inks whether he was going to fully render each of the figures that were multiple figures in motion, or whether he was going to do them the way that we did them on this page, where it's lighter outline to indicate the movement going too fast for the eye to see. This was a lot of fun to draw. However, Alan Moore knew me pretty well by this time, and Alan knew that if they were going to keep my interest long enough to make it through all 6 issues of 63, there was going to have to be a big frickin' dinosaur. And sure enough, the War Beast lived up to that. This is the main villain of the Fury comic. It's a telepathic late Cretaceous dinosaur who was hyper intelligent, had telekinetic powers, and could blast ray guns from his third eye in the middle of his head. Okay, I'm down. Again, Dave Gibbons inks over my pencils. This was a lot of fun to do. From 93 to 96, this is a point in my life where I was also a partner in a video superstore in Southern Vermont, I shifted gears into self-publishing. We made quite a nest egg off that Image comic series 1963, and it allowed Rick Veitch to self-publish his own dream comic called Roaring Rick's Rarebit Fiends, which I highly recommend. And by the way, Rick is still doing Roaring Rick's Rarebit Fiends as a print-on-demand comic that you can purchase all the new issues of via Amazon and Kindle. What I did with my nest egg was I bankrolled the comic I'd been wanting to do since I was 4 years old, which was the birth, life, and death of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. No time travelers, no science fiction element. He's not on a lost world. He's not going to have to crash into New York City for this story to work. I just wanted to present the life of an animal in a way that readers would identify with. And while I could have done a comic about white-tailed deer, and it might have sold well to deer hunters in New England and other parts of the North America, I knew dinosaurs were going to be a better seller. And also, I love drawing dinosaurs more than I love drawing white-tailed deer. So S.R. Bissette's Tyrant was the idea. I only managed to get 4 issues out before the entire direct sale market collapsed. But during that time, I did the best I could telling the story of a mother Tyrannosaurus Rex making her first nest, laying her first eggs, nurturing them to the point where they hatched. And the story was just beginning to bring us into the first day of life for those young hatchlings when I had to pull the plug on the project. But let me just walk you through part of this issue. This was issue number 2 of Tyrant. It was chapter 2 of the story. And what I was doing with a chapter called Blood and Berries is I wanted to walk the reader through something terrible having happened in the deep forest of the late Cretaceous of North America. And the thrust of the story was I'm going to lead the reader from the beginning of this event to the end of the event by following the path through the forest of something massive moving through the woods. And as we move through these woods, it was primarily silent panels because it's an entirely visual narrative in terms of we are moving through the forest. And once the narrative voice, the omniscient third-person narrative voice, my voice, if you will, because I did not anthropomorphize these animals in any way, this wasn't the land before time. Once we get to a point in this deep late Cretaceous forest where we begin to see damage to the trees and the ground, the story really kicks into gear. We begin to see how whatever was moving through the woods was so massive that it was uprooting trees. And every time it uprooted or broke a tree, it was disturbing the home of countless other life forms, right? Ants, spiders, amphibians, centipedes, salamanders, frogs begin to breed in the water that pools in the footsteps of this massive animal moving through the late Cretaceous forest. What is it that's moving through the forest? And as I get closer to what it is moving through the forest, the reader who read the first issue of Tyrant might recognize from the visuals that this female Tyrannosaurus Rex is the same one we met at the beginning of the story in the first issue. And this is her nest at the top of the hill. I had this distinctive broken tree stump to tag it. And the narrative now starts referring to one of the creatures that you're seeing. There is something in her mouth, something loose, wet. She wandered from the nest at dawn in search of food. The little ones were hungry, so she went to find berries. She found berries. She has berries in her mouth. She has to keep them in her mouth until she can return to the nest. Her litter is hungry. She has to keep them in her mouth. She has berries in her mouth for her little ones. She has to feed her little ones. I got a letter. I used to get a lot of letters on Tyrant, mainly from kids. I got a letter from a woman after this issue of Tyrant saw print. And in the letter, she said that her young son really loved Tyrant and she would read it aloud to him at night. And she said, I never thought I would read a dinosaur book that would bring me to tears. I used a simple trick by not telling the reader which animal the she was, and by saving the payoff for this page and for panel 2, where I reveal to you it's the vegetarian mother, the animal dying in the mother T-Rex's jaws, whose mind we're in, whose story I'm telling. My hope was it might pluck somebody's heartstrings at that point, and that letter from that mother proved to me I'd done it. At this point in the story, I had taken the reader to a place they did not expect to go. I had hoped to tell the entire story of Tyrant and Tyrant's surviving hatchlings and what life might have been in the late Upper Cretaceous for a young Tyrannosaurus Rex, but I didn't get to do that. The entire direct market imploded in 1996, and I basically had a choice, right? Was I going to invest all my time, money, and energy into getting my own kids through high school and making sure that I did the best for my family, or was I going to invest all my time, money, and effort into my comic book family, my dinosaur family? Well, I'm a family guy. My real life family wins every time. So I pulled the plug on Tyrant.
I had a doubt about, I see some similarities between the manga Gone by Masashi Tanaka.
Oh, I loved Gone.
Also, yeah.
Yeah, I love Gone.
Some similarities. I see some similarities between this Tyrant and Gone. Like,
Yeah.
were you influenced from the manga, or were you aware?
No, Gone was coming out in America right around the time I was doing Tyrant. So I had already worked up. I was probably 2 issues into Tyrant before I saw the first Gone. I love Gone, and I still have them all in my library. So good call. But it did not influence me. If there was an influence, and this might surprise some of you, it was really the animal books I read as a kid. There's a number of books from my childhood I still have here in my library. They include Black Beauty and Bambi. I loved storybooks that were from the point of view of the animals, and that was my goal. I wanted to tell the story of a dinosaur's life without anthropomorphizing, as best I could resist that urge as a storyteller, and without any human beings playing any role in this story, because human beings don't even exist on the planet yet at this point. So those were really the influences on Tyrant. Although I do love Gone, and that's a good call. We were contemporaries. It's funny how in the pop culture, all these things bubble up at the same time. You know, Jurassic Park hit just as I was getting ready to launch the first issue of Tyrant. And that was both good timing and bad timing, because everything everywhere. Yeah. Okay, so let me wind up. I had promised you all a 4th story. Let me tell you my last story of the night. And here we go. One more ghost story for Halloween. Put your lights out wherever you are, and let me tell you a story. I never liked Sunday. Mikey, come to breakfast, son. I like my mother and father, and I like eating breakfast, and I like the funnies, but I never liked Sunday. I hate Sunday. Come along, Michael. Oh, do I have to? Sunday was church. Now, you go right to sleep, young man. We'll be home after Mass. Have a good nap. We'll say a prayer for you. I was too young to go to church. I couldn't sit still that long, so I had to stay home alone. Father said I was too young to have the run of the house to myself, so I had to stay in the drawer and sleep. I curled up, and Father shut the drawer, and I listened to them leave. Then I cried myself asleep and waited for them to come home and let me out. They never came home. They never came home. They never will come home. Never, never, ever. I don't know why Mother and Father never came to let me out. All I know is the dark. And I know I hate Sunday and sleep. And I know that if anyone ever comes along and opens this drawer, I'm coming out. Bingo! That's my Halloween trick or treat for all of you. Okay, I'm going to close this talk by walking you through that was a 4-page comic story I just read to you. was an original story. I promised you tonight I'd tell you where these stories come from. That was based on a true story. Okay. A lot of churches in New England, I'm sure other parts of the US and Canada as well, but a lot of churches used to have long Sunday services. And when I was living in Grafton, Vermont, in a brick schoolhouse, that's where I was living when I did my part of 1941, the illustrated story. Rick Veitch was living in a one-room cabin on the other side of Grafton, and we would bicycle back and forth to each other with the pages. Rick had a younger brother who was a contractor. His name was Peter, and Peter and I really hit it off during the time I lived in Grafton. We became good friends. And Peter was doing a contractor job, and sometimes he'd come over to my house and we'd have lunch together. I'd take a break from the board, and Pete would have a bag lunch. He would just sit out in front and talk, and then he'd go back to work, and I'd go back to work. Peter told me a story that there was an old guy on one of the crews he was working with. And the younger guys in the crew figured out that this old guy was doing everything he could to avoid doing any part of the renovation in this house if it involved a confined space, right? A closet, a too small room. And they finally confronted this guy and asked him what the story was. And the guy said, well, I'm claustrophobic, guys. I can't stand being in a confined space. And he told them that when he was a little kid, when his parents would go to church on Sunday, and it was a super long mass, whatever religious denomination they were part of, there was a big dresser that his family had in their house. And they had one drawer where they had set it up as a bed for him, and he would have to go in the drawer, and they would shut the drawer, and that's where he'd have to lay down until they got back at the end of Mass. Now, this sounds to us today in the year 2021 like child abuse, okay? But there was no daycare. Churches didn't have anything set up for younger kids. And as a kid who grew up Catholic, going to masses that were usually only an hour long, you know, that's a tough haul when you're a little kid. It wasn't too great when I was 11 or 12 either, but I could handle it. So it kind of made sense. You know, I guess a lot of people that used to do this kind of thing. My first thought, of course, when Pete told me this story was, oh my God, what if something had happened, you know? And that's where this whole story came from, was that. That was the catalyst for the story. Okay, let's talk about approach to the story. How many times do you get to see the father in this story? Well, you're looking at it on page 1. You get to see him in silhouette in the doorway, and you get to see him as he's about to shut the drawer with their son inside. Now, I don't want you to hate this father. I mean, what he's doing seems really messed up to us in the 21st century, but you know, with his clothing and so on, and the fact there's Sunday funnies, I'm hoping that you'll accept this is early 1900. And I don't want you to hate this dad. So I based him on the most popular president in American history. I made him look like Abraham Lincoln. Now, none of us know why almost every American thinks Abraham Lincoln was a good president, but he rates pretty high among historians and Americans in terms of popular American presidents now. He was really hated and reviled during his presidency, enough that somebody blew his brains out. But Abe Lincoln was the perfect shorthand so that you might accept this father as someone other than an evil sadist. You can also see on this page the only real estate that the mother gets. She appears in panel 1 and she appears in panel 2. Now, I'm the writer as well as the artist, and I want you to like this mother. And so I make sure that in both cases that not only she's beautiful, attractive, she's wearing her Sunday gown, her hair's done up, you know, she's an attractive young wife, but both her word balloons, what she's saying to her son, express love and care. Come to breakfast, she feeds her son. Have a good nap, we'll say a prayer for you. There's nothing negative coming from this mom. Given what happens in this little story, that's about as good as I could do for them. Now, I also want you to really like Mikey from the first panel. I don't want you to hate this little kid. And again, I go to the shorthand of cartooning. Without going into copyright infringement, I make him look like Dennis the Menace. The American comic strip Dennis the Menace, not the British one in Beano, who's a little, little mischief maker. So is Dennis the Menace in America, but Dennis the Menace in America is not quite the ball of malice that the British one is. So that's the kind of shorthand I was going to use in these panels. Also, notice with the page design, even though it's a double page spread that I'm working with, I stack the panels and I stack the captions and word balloons to lead your eye down vertically, ending with Sunday was church. And then I did the inking on the father's pants and coat so that the lines of the inking would express not so much movement as pulling your eye up, 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 up to the drawer and his word balloon. Again, same kind of design on this page. The parents' word balloons are in the center of the spread. And then you can see that even though I've spaced it so it's not all one block of text, I stagger the text. Whenever you're doing a big block of text, fellow cartoonists out there, don't put them in a single box, right? Anyone reading a comic, when you hit one of those pages where there's a giant block of text, a lot of people stop dead. That's a little too formidable for them. So staggering the text the way I did in the block of text over the dresser in silhouette is one way to deal with a large body of text. And then I weave it down. Now, telling a story to a reader is kind of like you're a card player and you're in a game of poker and you want to lay down the cards in a certain order. In this case, there was a problem with this story, which is Mikey never finds out why his parents don't come home. But if you turn the page after page 2 and you don't know why Mikey's parents come home, the rest of the story is not going to work for you. So I have to show you at the bottom of this page why Mikey's parents don't come home. They have an auto accident. Now, all ghost stories and all horror stories involve sleight of hand. When you really think about this story, does it make sense? Well, no. Wouldn't somebody have come to their house after the accident looking for the kid? But the story wouldn't work if you thought too much about that. So I'm just going to keep you going with Mikey being the voice in your head as you're reading the story. And we're also going to go with the supposition that no, nobody ever opens that dresser drawer. Many horror and ghost stories hang on that kind of a conceit where if all I got to do is hold your attention for 4 pages, long enough to get a little chill out of you at the end of this story. That's really the thrust of a horror story. How do I get a rise out of you? How do I get a little frisson out of you? So another sleight of hand that I used here is we are all used to reading maps and diagrams. We don't think of them as comics, but they are. Any of you have ever flown on an airplane? If you paid any attention to the safety precautions that were being dictated to you, when they told you to take that, illustrated brochure out of the pouch of the seat in front of you, you're looking at comics, sequential narratives telling you what to do if there's an emergency on the plane. People are used to reading diagrams. So I have never had anyone indicate to me in either private or correspondence or in the public readings of this story that they were confused by this graphic. They understood once they saw a drawer and the top of a dresser that they were looking at a cross section of a dresser, and that I then can take the leap from the drawer shape being a drawer cross section to an inset panel showing you Mikey inside the drawer, inside the dresser, to taking a further leap to an inset panel that's showing you something that happens miles away later on. Also, if I only have one panel to show you what happened to Mikey's parents, yeah, I know those old Model Ts probably didn't move fast enough to be that horrific a collision, but I have to make that as visceral a panel as I possibly can. Again, this is a horror story. Okay, now we are with the dresser. Now, one of the things in a classroom I ask people is how many characters are there in this story, but I can't really do that with all of you, and I'm not going to put you through that online. So I'll tell you. Most people, when I say how many characters are there, they count the human characters. 1, 2, 3. Steve, there's 3 characters. And I go, no, there's more than that. The more adventurous students in the room will realize, oh, the dresser. The dresser is a prop, but the dresser is so central to this story. Yes, objects can be characters, okay? Don't always think in the same linear way that most of us as Western civilization human beings think. I think of all the inert objects in my world as being alive in some way. It's not because, you know, I'm a Buddhist or anything like that. It's just from a young age, I considered everything alive in the world, and I still see things that way. And when I'm drawing a comic, every prop, especially if it's an important prop, becomes a character. And in this case, the dresser is a character. Okay. How important is that character? Well, when I was working on this story, I talked to one of my contractor friends, and they said, "Yeah, yeah, we're working on a job now, and there's a really creepy dresser up in the attic." And they let me go over to the place they were working on, and I went upstairs to the attic, and I drew this dresser from an actual old dresser that was all cobwebbed and everything up in the top of this attic in southern Vermont. So I make that dresser as disturbing a dresser I can. And you'll note there's a lot of leakage from Mikey's drawer. That's all I'm going to say. Now, I am now going back to the representational drawing in panel 1. Like, that's a fairly realistic, quote, representational, unquote, version of a dresser. You recognize that drawing as a dresser. And then when I go to panel 2, I'm already starting to cheat. Like, the dimensions of those drawers are longer than the shape of the page. But I've never had anybody complain. Yeah, okay, that's the front of the drawer. And now this is the part of comics magic that comes in. If I go from exterior of a place to an entryway to a place, in my third panel, the reader will go with the next thing they expect to see is what's inside whatever that space is, okay? Picture this as a Spider-Man page. Panel 1 is a skyscraper. Panel 2 is the window outside of the skyscraper we're moving in on. And panel 3 is J. Jonah Jameson at his desk in the offices of the newspaper. We accept that kind of visual from exterior to close-up of exterior space that we're going to enter to the interior. But I go further here. If you've ever entered a darkened theater from a lit area and you walk into the theater and the door closes, you can't see. It takes a little while for our retina to adjust to the change in light. And that is the device I chose to use to hook the end of this story on. Yes, we go inside the dresser with Mikey, but we can't quite make him out yet. And it's going to take a little while for our eyes to adjust to that dim, dark interior. And that means I can slowly show you Mikey. In fact, all you have at the end of this page is an indication of a skeletal figure. And this is the final page. This also introduces us to the fifth character in the story. Sometimes an environment is character. And in this case, just as the dresser is a character, darkness is a character. And I designed this entire page around being on black paper. You'll notice every other page of this story is traditional comic format, panels drawn on a white negative page. I'm working with the traditional approach to the comic page with white gutters, white page. But when I get to the final page, the darkness is all encompassing. The darkness that surrounds Mikey is all that exists. Darkness is the fifth character. And now I zoom in closer and closer to Mikey until with the final punchline, I'm coming out. He is so close, you can almost smell him. I also switch my drawing tools from traditional pen, ink, brush, and toothbrush. That spatter that gives the texture in panel 1 and 2, that's toothbrush. You put some ink on a toothbrush and you flick it with your finger. To using Zipatone over whiteout at the bottom, fourth panel on this page. And here I was drawing on a textured paper that was called coquille board. You could draw on it with pen, brush, and ink, but you could also draw on it with crayon. And it would bring out that sort of rough texture. And I chose a deliberately very rough textured coquille board so that there was a really grotty texture to poor little Mikey as he's waiting to come out of the dresser. And you'll also notice that, as I say, every tool in the toolbook, the panel borders on the first 2 pages are all drawn with a ruler. Everything is straight and linear in little Mikey's world until it isn't anymore. And when you look at panel 2 here, I still drew it with a ruler, but I went with rough whiteout on the edges. I then hand drew the border for panel 3. and I loosely hand drew with a brush the border for panel 4, because now we are in the nasty negative universe that Mikey now lives in, and I don't want you comfortable. This isn't the land of comfortable ruled borders. And when I got to the fully black page, I hand drew every one of these borders with whiteout pen and made them as rough and scraggly as possible. Every one of these aspects of designing the comic page is a tool in your toolkit. Okay, those are the 4 stories I promised you, folks. I can take some questions. If anyone here has questions, I hope I didn't go too far over time this week. Where are we at, John?
It's 8:34, Stephen. So
hey, half hour shorter than last time. Okay, we're getting them tighter. So happy Halloween, one and all.
Right on time.
And I also want to make sure I bring to your attention special thanks to these folks, our sponsors for this event. I also want to thank the Center for Cartoon Studies, University of Connecticut, Appalachian State University, Virginia State University, who had sponsored earlier versions of some of the elements that are in this lecture, including the professors and instructors I worked with, Tom Roberts, James Stern, Michelle Ollie, and our host tonight, John Hart. I also want to thank the editors who guided and supported my work on the stories I just read to you, Joe Kubert, Dave Manick, Tom Schoolin. And I again want to thank my friend Tim Varick, who funded the $200 publication of my first ever comics work in Abyss #1 and only. And here's a little list of my published works. If you want to go find some of my work that's available right now, they're all available on Amazon and various online venues. I'll come back to this slide as we do the Q&A, but I also want to stress to you, all these lectures are being recorded. John, Stephen, and Stephen are making sure that once they check the recordings, they put them up online. They will be available to all of you for free. This poster is out there online all over the place. I post it every week or so to my own Facebook and Twitter page. Our next pair of panels is a 2-parter on dinosaurs in the pop culture. And those will be on November 10th and the following week, November 17th. There will not be a week break between the two. Okay, I'm ready for any questions anybody's got. John, you're in charge, I guess.
I had a question.
Okay,
about
I'm just letting you know. Hey, but 1 second, Abu, 1 second.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say there's nothing in there. It's okay. You're all right. There's nothing in the chat, and I was just saying I had put in a question about the page turn, but I think you answered on the page turn how to mirror and how to deepen into the page turn. So I appreciate that. So if people do have a question, just if you want to raise your hand by here, Abu has a question. So we'll start with Abu, and if you just do your reaction button, and you can put up your hand, and I'll go in that order. All right, go ahead, Abu.
I'm ready.
Okay. Yeah. So I had a question about Japanese horror. Like, what is your take on Japanese horror films and horror manga? For example, Ju-on the Grudge films. What is your take on Japanese horror as a whole?
I love all of it. I have to say, I am fortunate in that a lot of the early English language translations of Japanese ghost stories and writers like Edgar Rampo were actually originally co-published here in my home state of Vermont. There was a publishing company run by a man whose last name was Tuttle, and he had 2 bases for his publishing company. One was in Rutland, Vermont, and the other was in Tokyo, Japan. So I grew up with access in my local Northern Vermont little dinky library to classical Japanese ghost stories because they carried those editions. So I grew up with a lot of the classic medieval and more contemporary early 20th century Japanese ghost fiction. That means that once the Japanese ghost films began to be available in America, which actually started happening in the 60s. I think the first one I ever saw was Onibaba from
Onibaba.
Right, Onibaba from, I think it was made in 1966 or 67. And Onibaba means the hole. That's the first Japanese ghost film I saw, and it really moved me. Not just terrified me, it was also a very erotic film. It was about the mother and daughter who were killing samurai and stealing and selling their armor. And the mother becomes jealous when her daughter falls for a man. And she's afraid that if the daughter goes off with this man, that she'll die of starvation because she can't kill these samurai and do their operation by herself. So she steals this mask from that's on one of the samurai they kill. And when they remove the mask, the samurai's face under the mask is hideously scarred. And she tries to terrify her daughter into coming back to her by putting on the mask and appearing out of the reeds. I won't give away the ending. It has an incredibly powerful ending. And then there were a couple other Japanese ghost films that made it to us in the 60s. This predates the J-horror movement of the 90s. But they were films like Kwaidan, which I highly recommend, KWAI, right? And there was another one called...
Kuroneko? Was it
Yeah,
Kuroneko?
the one with the cat women. Yes, the one with the cat women. And so, I was already into the Japanese ghost films. And what drove me nuts is I had read in books by scholars like Donald Ritchie that there were all these Japanese ghost movies from the 50s and early 60s, but we couldn't see them in America. And then once video hit, and especially once DVD hit, my wife bought me an all-region DVD player, and I started buying those older Japanese ghost films. And it just happened to coincide with the J-horror movement when, we got the first wave of J-horror here in America. And for me, it wasn't so much the ghost films. I think the first one that blew my mind was, it's not a ghost story. It's a film called Tetsuo, Tetsuo. And it is this completely insane cyberpunk kaiju movie about how human beings in accidents, their bodies begin to meld with metal, and then suddenly they're sprouting these metal organs. And it's like David Cronenberg meets David Lynch meets the craziest bastard you ever saw ranting on the street, and that they did a movie together. So I love J-horror. I'm into all of it. I have a huge collection of upstairs, and I could go on and on for an hour, but you get the idea. I love it. Now, you asked about the manga, and yes, I also love the Japanese horror manga. I'll just mention one cartoonist. My all-time favorite right now, I buy everything that comes out, is Junji Ito. His masterpiece to me is still Uzumaki, The Spiral. But he's done a lot of great graphic novels since then. But I particularly love Junji Ito's short horror manga. There is one horror manga Junji Ito did that I recommend to all of you that involves...
Enigma of the Amigara Falls.
Is that the one with the human shapes in the cliff?
Yes.
Yeah.
Enigma of the Amigara Falls.
It's about this geological malformation that a group of people in Japan find, where these holes in a cliff face look like cutout human figures, and people are suddenly get this compulsion to fit their bodies into these holes. And if you do that, you start being sucked into the mountain. Just amazing stuff. So there you go. I think I answered the question.
You did. All right. Thank you, Stephen. Let's see. Steve Tucky has a question. Go, Steve.
Yeah, so I'm curious. You spent some time talking about the layout of the page,
yes,
and the specific choices that you make as an artist and as a designer to kind of draw attention in a particular pattern. I'm wondering, do you know of any like empirical studies that have been done on the way people read comics, like the way they approach comics? Or is this just something that's like artisanal information that gets passed down? It's because it almost smacks of like, this is what we know of the way people read comics. Does that come from someplace? Is there other studies?
Stephen, when I was starting in the field, there weren't. Okay, I mean, the only instructional book other than how to draw cartoons type books that was out there was the first one that Will Eisner did, where he did walk through many aspects of his approach to the aesthetics of telling a story in the comics form. And then, of course, almost everyone here should be familiar with Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, which uses the comics medium in a much more organic way than even Will Eisner had to get into how comics function as a media, as an art form. But the empirical studies that are out there, and I've got a large library of academic texts here, and please pardon my French, but as somebody who's been professionally drawing comics since 1977, many of them are almost impenetrable reads to me. I don't know any cartoonist that I have ever met who uses the language that academia has embraced to try to parse out how the kinetics, the design, the flow of the comics form, graphic novels, the comic books, whatever you want to call this medium we work in, how it works. I don't know any cartoonist that talks like that. I don't know. Yeah, we do use terms like balloon, caption, gutter, panel. You know, that's like hammer, screwdriver, drill. You know, that's the basic nuts and bolts. That's our toolkit. But the empirical studies that I've read, and again, pardon my French, are compelling as some of them are almost impenetrable, and a lot of them are horseshit. We just don't. I understand as the reader, I understand as the outside reader, and particularly having taught for 15 years at the Center for Cartoon Studies, and I do a lot of writing, in a fairly academic manner about cinema. So I get it. If you're an outsider looking at the form, you're struggling to find written language to communicate what you're seeing visually, and it's an ill fit. There's a famous quote from somewhere that it's like dancing about architecture. Good luck.
Yeah.
But one of my favorite moments, let me share this with you, Stephen. This might answer your question. One of my favorite moments at any academic conference I've ever been to, and I've been to a fair number of them, and I've participated in a fair number of them. My favorite moment of any academic conference was at Bennington College, and one of the guests was Mike Mignola, right? And a group of academics had Mike Mignola up on stage. He was doing a panel. He did a presentation about some of his work on Hellboy, and then he took questions from the audience. And one of the academics had this very convoluted question. And Mike and I are not close friends, but we've known each other, from the days when we first met at comic conventions back in the 80s, when we were both cutting our teeth in the industry. I could tell by Mike's face, this was really painful for him to listen to this question. And basically, they were asking what was the purpose of those sort of non sequitur panels that Mike Mignola will place on some of the pages in Hellboy. And if you're a Hellboy reader, you all know what I'm talking about. There'll be a sequential narrative sequence where there's a certain flow of panels, but Mike will insert images of like an architectural detail, or a fly-blown zombie chimp happens to be looking in the door, or something like that. And this is what the academic was like asking Mike, like, what is the purpose of those panels? And Mike sort of grit his teeth, made it through the question, and just said, I don't know, they just look good to me there. Right? And I'm not being flippant or in any way disparaging to either the academic asking that question, and certainly not to Mike Mignola, who I love and whose work I love and adore and cherish and study. But that cuts to the chase. We are usually working instinctively. And I deliberately chose for all of you tonight 4 stories where I could articulate for you some of the aspects of why I made the decisions I made, because the stories could show you on the page the fruits of that thinking. But I've done a lot of work in comics I can never explain to you. There are certain stories that I would have liked to included in a lecture like tonight that I never would, because I couldn't explain them. I've done a number of dream stories. If it makes, Joe Kubert once said to, not just to me, but to an entire classroom, Joe once said to us, if it looks good, it is good in comics, right? And he's sort of right. If it works for the reader, it works. And we may not be able to describe for you, Stephen, what our thinking was, and there may not, and I don't believe there is a vocabulary adequate to the process other than the doing of it and the reading of it. And some of that we can talk about, but some of it is just Looney Tunes decisions we make. And if it looks right to us or it feels right to us, we go with it. Sometimes they're arbitrary. When I started my dinosaur comic, Tyrant, I realized that having a narrator was a real minefield, right? And I didn't want the reader to like hear Kenneth Branagh's voice in their head, you know, like I didn't want it to be that authoritative a narrative voice. But I made an aesthetic decision early on, which was I would never have a caption inside a panel unless the caption was reflecting the thought of the creature in the panel. So if you study the 4 issues of Tyrant that I published, all the captions are in the gutters. All the captions are outside the panel area until or unless they are suddenly engaged with the thought process of the creature, including what I showed you tonight, right? I go to a caption at the point where I tip my hand to you that it's the vegetarian dinosaur, the duckbill dinosaur whose thought we're in, the berries in her mouth, and then I switch gears. Now, no reader has ever said to me, "Oh, Steve, I see what you were doing here." I've never had anybody say that. It should be entirely unconscious for the reader, but it works.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question, Steve?
Absolutely. It's fascinating. I think it's a fascinating aspect of the art form, and the fact that it almost escapes that level of analysis it's just so fascinating.
Awesome. We have one more question. I just wanted to share. I have my Mike Mignola monkey with gun.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
The guy would say, like, "What happened with that? Why'd you draw that?" And he's like, "I like monkeys, and I think it looks cool with a gun." I mean,
that's it.
And he's sitting on his skull, so you're like, "Hey, So it doesn't make sense. It looks really cool.
It doesn't have to make sense. It's Mike's
That's
comic.
what I'm saying. I think lots of it. I mean, I remember when I asked you before, and then we'll get to Amanda's question. That how did the paneling go in Swamp Thing? Because it really did avoid the 6 panel, and you said the same thing. I hate that boring thing. And so you guys did these beautiful framing elements, and then you did a lot of natural motion. And when I looked later, because I never saw that the earlier stuff, but in the early Kirby stuff, he had a very kinetic thing, and he used all different shapes. He didn't use squares all the time. He used triangles and he used circles, and he had things crossing the borders on purpose to show motion through it. So it's like it's an older technique, but then I think you really captured it again. And then I had written in the comments down there. Then I saw Sam Keith when he did the Wolverine Venom story, and it was just that really wild paneling up and down all over the place. Just wild motion, because those guys are like trying to kill each other.
As long as the page is readable. I mean, to me, the worst thing you can do is confuse the reader's eye, because if you don't know where to look next, we've lost you. And if you're pulled out of the story trying to figure out where to look next, then you just got yanked out of the story. We failed. I can go as crazy with layout as I want to go, as long as I'm leading your eye, as long as I'm helping you make your way unconsciously through the page. But the reason, I mean, that Jack Kirby started doing it in 1938, 1939, right? And there are earlier examples than that from comic strips. Editors hate it, because editors see it as a problem. As soon as you break the grid, you're introducing potential production problems. But shapes have power, and comic panels, the shape they take has emotional power, and the design of the page communicates something emotionally, and it communicates something emotionally immediately when your eye first kisses it. And it communicates something emotionally when you finally engage with it and read it in whatever fashion you read the comics. And it's not just the shape of the panels and the layout of the page. It's also use of color, use of, as I indicated during one of the stories I walked you through, placement of word balloons and captions. All that stuff has emotional communicative power as well as the visuals. I'll leave you with this to answer your question before Amanda, we finally take your question. Sorry for the wait. When I first met David Lloyd, the artist of V for Vendetta, the first thing David Lloyd said to me was, he started an argument. He said, you use red in your comic pages. You should never use red in your comic page, right? And the fact that I instantly jumped into an argument Dave and I hit it off, right? But to David at that time, and this would have been when I first met him in 1984. At that time, David's aesthetic was such that he would not, to him, the color red was problematic because as soon as you turn the page, the reader's eye is going to go to the red. And I jokingly said, well, Dave, what do you think John Taliban and I could possibly do when we were working with the Demon, who's the color of a stop sign and a yield sign? I mean, red and yellow are the two most eye-catching colors you can have. And we had to make that 3-issue narrative and many issues after work with the Demon, red and yellow. So the way I saw it is, okay, knowing the reader's eye is going to go there first, I'm going to use that, right? And that became another tool in my toolkit if I either knew the color that the colorist was going to put down, or in the case of the stories where I did the color as well as the pencils and so on. So it was interesting to me years later when David Lloyd did a 1-issue, 1-shot Alien story, and he uses a lot of red in it, and he uses it masterfully. So, Amanda, you've been very patient.
Yes, let's hear it, Amanda.
Hi there. Nice to meet everybody.
Me
Thank
too.
you very much for the event. Hi.
You're welcome.
So quick question. I loved watching it. I loved watching the last one too. So you were talking about gray pencils and shading earlier, and I've been I'm drawing myself right now. I'm illustrating a graphic novel. I hope for it to reach maybe 200 pages. I'm at 80 right now, but thanks. I'm determined.
You will do it. You will do it.
Now that you said so, I have to. So, but back for the gray color. So I've been trying to stick to a lot of flats, blacks, contour lines, and some very simple cross hatching or just a couple of just nice tight lines for simple shading, because I'm worried about the printing when it reaches that point, no matter who publishes me or not. I'm just very worried about if I make some of it grayscale, would that limit choices in the future? So when you went through, you were talking about printing, and you were also talking about grayscale, and then you're talking about watercolor. It's just so fun. I could tell you're having so much fun flowing with the materials, becoming one with them on that page. How did you what kind of little things along the way made you choose what was best, I suppose? So for
okay. That's a great question, Amanda. You know, it depends on the job. I mean, I am a commercial freelancer, right? I've done a lot of comics for my own interest, and I have self-published, but I'm primarily a commercial freelance artist when I'm working as an artist, illustrator, cartoonist. You know, first I try to find out how the work I'm going to do is going to be printed. And if that's not available to me, and it sounds like it's not to you, it sounds like you're finishing the work and then hoping for the best. In the case of a job where all the control is in my hands, I will choose the medium that best serves the story. Case in point, when John Taliban and I were working on Swamp Thing, we really pushed the envelope in terms of using everything we could think of that we knew was possible with the kind of printing that 4-color comic book printing and newsprint would do at DC Comics. So we would sometimes do, well, let me show you something. Let me go back a bit here. This is show and tell time, Amanda. Okay, for Tyrant, right? I was drawing this for myself, but I was drawing it to be printed as cheaply as possible because I was a self-publisher. I could only afford newsprint publishing at the time. So I went with crow quill, brush, and pen. There is no wash, there is no watercolor, okay? However, when I did my covers, where I knew the best printing was going to be, I went to town, right? This Tyrant cover that you're looking at is Dr. Martin dyes, which are very iridescent and bright, watercolor, colored pencil, whiteout pen, and of course brush and ink, and brush pen and ink for the underdrawing. So my covers, I could indulge what I wanted to do with color and watercolor, perhaps even grayscale if I decided to go that way. But my interiors on Tyrant were only black and white line work. nothing that demanded a grayscale halftone printing. The slight tone you see here is the discoloration of aging paper from 1996, right? Now, let me back up a little further. Okay, when I was doing Cottonmouth, this grayscale that you see, we used to have a paper available to us that was called Duo Shade. And you would, I'm sorry, and you would brush on a chemical, and one chemical would bring out the cross-hatching that you see around the sockets of the man's eye in the first panel. And the other chemical would bring out the single line gray that you see on the edge of his nose, the top of his brow, and so on. And then I would use brush and pen to do the cross-hatching on the hands in the foreground because I wanted them to look like they were closer to you than the face that was further away. You see that? And Abu, a note for you. You had asked me about cross-hatching as well, and Amanda just brought up cross-hatching. Notice
Yes,
with the hands how I curve the line of the cross-hatching so that I'm describing the volume of the form. It's not just a flat crosshatch, which would flatten the hands. They wouldn't look like muscles of a knuckle. It wouldn't look like that part of your hand. But by curving those lines, I'm giving shape to the cross-hatching. Does that make sense to all of you? So, Amanda, to continue the answer to you. So when we were doing Swamp Thing, okay, this page, see that figure of Arcane at the top third? Everything printed in red?
Yeah.
That was drawn on a separate sheet of clear acetone. John Tolliban took that part. When I penciled this, it was in my pencil drawing. That was all on one sheet of illustration board. And then when John Tolliban inked it, John and I talked about, hey, what if Arcane was only visible in red? And that's why the background is pure yellow. If you put magenta, which is the color used for red, against yellow, it makes bright red. It makes the brightest red you can get in 4-color comics. So John Tolliban would sometimes draw elements of our panels on a separate sheet of acetate, and we would put an instruction in ink on it, which the production department would trim out before printing, telling our colorist, Tatiana Wood, what we were looking for. And Tatiana always knew what we were about. She got it, and she loved working on the book, in part because we would push that. And that's why Tatiana uses red, bright red, at the bottom of the panel, because it frames it all off. So my answer to you, Amanda, without having your pages in front of me and being able to offer more concrete suggestions, is if you don't know how your work is going to be printed, do the best you can, work with the media that works best for you at that point in the story, and don't be afraid of mixing media. There is no reason you can't switch from one sequence being drawn one way and another sequence. Let's say your character goes from a brightly lit room to an outdoor moonlit nightscape. You can change the drawing tools you're working with as long as I can still tell who is who. As long as you don't confuse me as the reader thinking that, oh, where'd that person go? Like, is this a different person? As long as you're adhering to the fundamentals of tagging your characters and making sure I always can tell who I'm looking at, then I would say go with it. If you want an example from a different kind of cartoonist altogether, just pick up any Gary Panter Jimbo collection, because Gary Panter changes his drawing style at whim, panel to panel, page to page, and it's part of the beauty of his work. And as a reader of Gary Panter's work, it's part of what I always loved about his work. So I hope that helps. I hope I answered your question.
It does. And I even have one if you felt like, I know I don't want to, it's just a question.
Bring it on.
Period.
I'm okay with it as long as Stephen Tucky doesn't shut us all down. So
I think I'm on video. I can't see myself though, so
You
sorry.
are. You are.
Anybody see that?
oh, let me get out of screen sharing so I can see what you're doing. Stop share. Oh yeah, I can see it now. Yes. Yes. Oh wow, that's beautiful.
All right. I wish, you know what? I should pop it out of the frame really fast.
No, that's okay. We can see it. We can see it. The reflections are there, but we can see it. Yeah, that looks beautiful.
A lot of details, but my problem with it is, if you look really closely, I have all those details in the building, and then I have the people floating above it, but there's just so much information on a page. And I noticed with your work, you have a lot of information on the page at once, and you can separate the characters from the background so intensely. And it just looking at that, because your grayscale really worked with your pencils with the graphite, and then but just to separate them more without adding a really thick black line or something.
Yeah, adding a thick black line around your characters, you know, it's almost like an animation cell, Amanda. That'll make them pop out against the background. But I have to say, it's also an aesthetic decision. There are certain cartoonists, Jean Giraud, Mobius, and if you're not familiar with Jean Giraud's work, type in Mobius, Moebius, and take a look at Mobius's work for either Metal Hurlant or heavy metal. He would draw these landscapes where your eye would just get lost in the detail. But when he got to the elements in the story where you had to pay attention to a particular character or a particular motion, he would tune that out and he would just focus on that character. I'm also thinking of, I'm having a brain fart. Who was it who drew Hard Boiled? Oh, Jeff Darrow.
Yeah.
Jeff Darrow is a cartoonist whose work, like your work that you just showed us, Amanda, is so dense with detail that I can spend easily a half hour just looking at one panel of Jeff's work. But that's his aesthetic. It's not a problem for me as a reader. In fact, it's part of the reason I like reading Jeff Darrow's work, right? Is it suddenly becomes it's kind of like Jeff Darrow is the Where's Waldo expert of comic narratives, right? And it looks to me like the aesthetic you're cultivating, Amanda, instead of fighting it, you know, don't feel like you've done anything wrong. Like with that huge spread you showed us, yeah, the reader's eye is going to get lost. That's okay. Sometimes that's the way you pace a story. When I was doing Tyrant, when I wanted to stop the reader's eye or have them slow down in reading, I have no control any more than you do at what speed a reader reads something you've drawn. But if I put a lot of detail on the page, I can slow down their reading because I can count on some readers, perhaps even most readers, will spend more time on a page that has more detail. Clearly, Jack Kirby was thinking the same way when he did Fantastic Four, and he would do those photo collages when, like, the Fantastic Four entered another dimension and there'd be a double-page spread, and suddenly we're out of the Jack Kirby drawn universe and we're in this bizarre photo collage, and it worked. You know, when I was a kid reading that stuff, it was like, oh my God, it took me into another reality, which was the reason he did it. So your drawing, Amanda, that you just held up, I don't know about the rest of you, but it was pulling me into another reality. And I love that. I love that. So if you're looking to keep clarity, yes, an easy shorthand is to use thicker outline around your characters or your primary object that you want the attention to be paid. But I would also say don't fight an aesthetic if it's an aesthetic you're working with, because we'll feel your distress and discomfort, and not in a good way. We'll be like, what is she doing? Go with the flow. If that's where the work has to take you, then take us there.
Thank you very, very much.
That's my pep talk for the night.
All right, so we're gonna thank you very much, everybody. That was the last question for tonight. I know everybody has his hand up, but we're gonna move on for the night. It's shortly after 9. Thanks everybody for coming and being patient and asking your questions. Thanks, Stevens. It's phenomenal to check out. Perfect storytelling night for Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
Have a happy Halloween, everybody. And our next event, we have an event coming up for ConCon on November 3rd. Check out jacksonconcon.org. Don't forget, in December, there's going to be a drawing for some little gifties that Stephen is sending our way. Everybody have a great night, and we will see you soon.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.